Hello and welcome to today's Student Experience podcast. Today, my special guest is Associate Professor Lydia Woodyatt. Lydia is an experimental social psychologist. Her research examines the ways that individuals, couples and groups respond to and work through failure and wrongdoing. She examines emotions, motivations and the influence of dynamic context on human behaviour. At Flinders University, Lydia also specialises in curriculum-based approaches to increase engagement and motivation, build healthy relationships, support student wellbeing, as well as that transition into and out of university. Welcome, Lydia.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Now, prior to reading your work, I hadn't actually, for some reason, made the connection between shame and failure, even though it does seem rather obvious when you think about the effect failure does have on people. And so many of our students actually wrestle with failure, all that sense of inadequacy when they don't meet their own or others' expectations, particularly when it comes to grades. So how can we better support students, or what can we as academics and support staff do differently to help students in this area?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing because my research on shame and guilt came from a different place to my research supporting students. But you're right. These are really logical things. We often think about student wellbeing as trying to increase, positive experiences of learning. But actually learning is really difficult. And if you're doing it right, it's difficult. If you're challenging yourself. And it also, I guess it's kind of unpacking why is it difficult. And I think especially at university, it's difficult because it relates to a real transition from who you were before to what you're going to become. And what you're going to become isn't quite clear yet. And whether or not you're going to be able to make it to that thing isn't quite clear yet. On top of that, you may not have all the skills you need yet to actually get there. So if we take that into consideration, then we can start to see that in that context, humans are really wired to think about things like my identity, my need for belonging, how I relate to others, whether or not I'm meeting the expectations of what it means to be a good and acceptable group member or relationship partner. And in these kinds of social evaluative contexts, that's when we start to get emotions arising like shame and guilt. So shame when we evaluate ourselves and we think, no, actually, I'm not a good group member or relationship partner, I'm not living up to what I'm supposed to be. And guilt when we feel like we're not living up to those responsibilities. And so we see this when people fail, but not just then. We see it, of course, in procrastination, right? So people are like, I saw, a meme on our Flinders social media page the other day that was something around Netflix and guilt. And there's quite a few, these come up all the time, where you're supposed to be studying, but you're not studying, but now you feel guilty, but you're still not studying. So managing our emotions is a huge part of the learning journey. So how do we help students with that? Well, we just remember that context that they're in, that moving from where they were before to where they are going. I think there's a couple of things that are really key there. Helping them to actually think about that in an explicit way. Where are you headed? What do you want to be? What are the skills you're going to need to get there? And this idea that any task you do is not all or nothing around, am I going to be a great, psychologist or doctor or, writer or whatever it is I'm aiming for. No one task is all or nothing around that. So we know that shame and guilt and a lot of the negative emotions, stress in itself, start to go up when we start to have an all or nothing attitude. Like if I fail at this one thing, it's all over. So I think we can really help by creating explicit messaging around that we're learning the skills to get from here to there, wherever there is going to be, and we're going to explore that, and we might not exactly know, and that's okay too. But really saying, I guess, to make it really explicit they're on that journey and normalizing that those emotions are going to arise, because that's also part of professional life. We all deal with those feelings. So normalizing how we actually deal with those and that when they're going to come up and what we do to get over them.
And I think, you touched on a really important point there too. We're not all going to the same place. And sometimes students come in thinking that there is this ideal outcome at the end, that they're going to move into this perfect job or this, it's going to look exactly like this.
And smoothly as well, of course.
Yeah.
With no bumps along the way.
No, none of that real life stuff. And yeah, I think it is that, how do we actually prepare students? And I know, and I can't remember which country it is now, somewhere in Northern Europe, but they have like a pass and not yet. So you don't fail, but it's it's that opportunity to learn from it and get that different mindset.
And that sense of growth mindset we often talk about, that, or incremental mindset, this idea that it's not all or nothing. You're not good at maths or not good at maths. You're just learning maths. And you're, if you can get students to say that, I'm not good at it yet, that's the more of the mindset we want, that these things are not all or nothing. Everything's just practice and being engaged in the learning environment, and us helping them to find, it's almost like an experiment with ourselves, right? What's the strategy that's going to work for you in the learning environment? So I often see myself as a kind of a curator of learning experiences that enable students to then test how that works for them, and when it will click for them. And it might be different for each student in the room.
And so maybe, like, when you're saying that, I'm sort of thinking maybe we need to be taking a different approach in terms of how we communicate that sort of messaging for our formative assessments, so they understand that it's not the end of the world, that this is just the check-in stage, and and thinking about how we do our marking and our actual grading as well, so they actually feel that yes, there is this summative one, and this is just the building blocks to that.
Yeah, and I think I think my teaching has improved the more I've gotten explicit around all of that. So the more that I've understood what I'm actually trying to get them to do and why I'm trying to get them to do it, and I make that explicit to them. I actually had a student who wrote in one of my evaluations of teaching. She said, Lydia's so good, not for just the content, but for the meta teaching, the teaching about teaching. And I love that she even came up with that term and got what I was doing. Because what we're trying to get them to do is be like that idea of student partnership, being partners with their own learning. And they can't do that if you're not helping them to understand what it is they're going through and why it might be stressful and how they respond to that. So that's around formative assessment. I do it around almost every class we have. I would spend a couple of minutes talking about why we're doing it, how it relates to a professional skill, how you might have some aspects of this but not others, what's the bit that you're working on, how are you going to improve on that. So there's things within the classroom we can do. I also think there's things that we can do kind of across the institution to kind of frame that a bit more explicitly. This idea that everyone comes in with something, so value what you bring to the environment, but also we're going to build other skills. So, I can see places where we're starting to talk about these sorts of skills as explicit small micro credentials or, digital badges, or the idea of actually making it, I think of it like Lego blocks. You choose the ones you need to add on to flesh out the skills you need. And I think any of that makes it explicit that this is growth and professional development is good, that you don't have to have it all, The other thing is normalising the difficulties. So the barriers, the procrastination, the wheels falling off, because that happens too. That's part of our story of success, right? So normalising that, telling stories about that, I think is absolutely essential for like us as leaders in the classroom, that we do that. Then we have other students do that as well, because a lot of the way we make sense of our own negative emotion and our own negative experiences is through the experiences of others who are like us. So it's in that kind of social, I think of it as that social identity, that shared social identity. That's the meaningful context where we start to make sense of these sorts of experiences. So as a teacher, I can help my students by building a place where they build shared identity, but then enabling some people to be leaders in that space and tell stories of diversity, of difficulty, of, dealing with procrastination, dealing with struggles writing, dealing with difficulties reading, dealing with, social anxiety, all the different issues that kind of come up, commonly in the classroom. I don't know about you, but I have students come in and out of my office. You're in my office at the moment. You sit in that chair over there and who tell me these sad stories, but they feel like they're the only one going through it. But really, there's strings of them coming through. And I guess a few years ago, I just had this aha moment that I know that this is normal, but they don't know it. Trying to build that sense of these are normal, this is the struggles that can arise, this is how we cope with them.
Yeah, and I love that sense, that overt teaching, because that's the approach I have with my Learn to Learn program. If they don't understand how they learn, and what the purpose is for everything we're doing, it's really hard for them to stay motivated and keep on focus. So,
Yeah, and it's a really important call out, I think, for higher educators in every discipline that, we have two jobs. We have our research specialty job, and we continually upskill ourselves in those areas, but we also have a responsibility to upskill ourselves in the higher education space and to be experts at teaching as well. It's actually not okay to not be good at that. That's a huge part of our job, and that's what we're responsible to. So, I think we've passed the time where it was okay to kind of say, oh, well, I just get up and teach my content. I think we're well past that. We should know why it is that we're doing what we're doing and be able to be explicit with our students.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the other really important points you brought up was about that sense of that peer learning, and that sort of the connection with you as the lecturer, and human connection in that sense of being seen being so critical to our personal well-being and sense of belonging. And I know you have your 5 meaningful minutes approach. Can you tell us a bit about how we can embed that, what it is for those that aren't familiar with it, and how we can look at embedding that into our way of being, particularly now that we're much more online, and what that would look like differently in that case?
Yeah. So the 5 meaningful minutes is basically using an idea that came from actually a book called Small Changes to Teaching. And this idea that to help the big issues, we don't have to spend all of our time on it. We actually can just spend small little touch points in every class, or when we're designing our curriculum, or just small little moments where we attend to something meaningful. And I've just applied that to a wellbeing lens. So when we look at wellbeing, we can talk about basic psychological needs. And generally we look at things like need for belonging. So we've already spoken about that today. Need for agency, need for purpose, and that need for growth or mastery, competence. So those 4 needs to me are kind of really core to who we are as humans, how we're motivated, the emotions that arise in response to that, but also our well-being. And so as a teacher, if I can build in a couple of minutes in each class where I'm addressing one of those, then I'm going to be supporting my students in their well-being. So again, there's lots of work around this. You can look at especially the work on self-determination theory, and how that kind of applies to teaching. I think you can use that if you want to upskill yourself and learn about it. But for me, it's really simple things like helping students to reflect on if it's related to growth or purpose. We're coming to this task, this is what we're trying to teach you, but of these 4 things that we're trying to teach you, which one matters to you and why is that? And where are you at on that now, and where do you want to be by the end of the session? So we're starting to increase that sense of agency, connectedness to the learning, purpose in the learning, sense of belonging. This is around often that emerging professional identity. So I often say to my new teachers, remember that you are the leader in that space. You are the identity leader. The only version they really have when they start out of what it means to be the professional in your discipline is you. So I know, and all of my teachers are like, oh God. But we are the leader in that space. So we send the messaging around, are you one of us? And that's all they want. They want to be one of us. So within the class, are we building that sense of connection between class members and with you as a leader of that shared identity? And so that's, to me, like a lot of what we spoke about before, normalizing those experiences, being a human. Obviously you don't have to overshare, but sharing small parts of yourself and your story so that they can find something that they identify with. And allowing them to explore that identity of who they want to be. What are the things that may matter to them? What values in particular? I think values are a really important thing in the learning environment. So rather than being driven just by emotion, we want to be driven by our values. So actually, we're coming up to this task. What value really matters to you when we go about this? How do you want to go about this as a result of that value? And starting to give them that opportunity. And that really reaffirms that need for belonging, because the need for belonging, if we think about it as, am I being a good group member or relationship partner? Until we know what it means to be a good group member or relationship partner, that's like our gauge is like, whoa, I don't know. Am I being good? I don't know. I got my reference hearing wrong. Maybe I'm being bad. Whereas when we start to make clear messages and help them to kind of share together, okay, well, what does it mean to be an us? That actually allows them, their brain, to kind of calm down a bit and go, oh, no, I know what the standards are. I'm doing it. I'm okay. Or I'm not meeting it yet, but I'm on the way and I need some help and I can get help. So those things are all around our need for belonging as much as they're about competency.
I can
The other
definitely
thing
see
I think,
that with the group stuff, because so many
yeah,
times it's that real anxiety without even knowing what it is,
yeah,
because we don't know what
just
it
feeling
is.
uncertain, right? Yeah.
Yeah. How do I go about
It's
this group work thing, and what does that mean? And yeah.
Yeah. And if we don't give them explicit messages, I think it gets placed onto all sorts of funny other things as well.
Mm.
So I think human brains are looking for that feedback of, am I being a good and appropriate group member? And if you don't give it that an explicit hang point, it can hang on other things. The other thing I'd say is probably how we interact with them. So being predictably kind, I think, is an important thing. And that doesn't mean we make it easy. That doesn't mean we don't give, clear guidelines and standards and expectations. Actually, the opposite. We should be very clear and explicit. But I do think we also have to be interpersonally, I think of it as being interpersonally navigable. That is, when they come and respond to you, are they going to get a roughly predictable response? If some days you're really kind and then other days you're in a rush and really like they just get the raw end of you. Now that we all have bad days, but trying to be consistent as much as possible, because those, when people are in that situation of uncertainty, they're looking, any threat that arises, so anything that looks like a rejection is going to be a heightened rejection until they kind of get that sense of confidence. And so, yeah, those initial interactions, another thing I say to my new teachers is, remember that you might have heard that question 500 times, but it's this student's first time asking. And if you respond in the wrong kind of way, it might be the only time they ask. So, those interpersonal messages, especially when you're the leader in the space, so important for so many psychological reasons.
Totally. And, sometimes we think, and I know I've had the conversation with staff before around, people are being lazy because they just ask instead of looking. And it's like, but have you actually thought that maybe it's not easy to find? So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily.
How do you train them out of that habit, right? Like,
yeah.
We'll all be lazy if we're allowed to be. Like, you've got to kind of gently train them out of the habit. Does that mean I always get it right? No. This is teaching. We make mistakes all the time too, but keep aiming for that.
I think COVID-19 in particular has really highlighted the vulnerability of our students in terms of their well-being, and part of that's also financial, which also affects well-being. So everything seems to come back to that. Can you share with us some thoughts on how we can rethink our management of students, or perhaps our support system, so that we're providing a more holistic well-being approach for now and into the future?
Yeah, it is it's a really challenging one, because often the needs of our students are actually beyond the resources that we have access to. I guess there's two ways worth thinking about that. One is, what resources do I have in the classroom, and how I set up my teaching space to run. And I guess what COVID's taught us is, take away the stuff that doesn't matter. Make sure the stuff that does matter is really clear and easy to access. And focus on that. It's not that it has to be the most amazing presentation. Actually, our students are really grateful just for us being kind and making it navigable for them. That when they want to learn, they actually can just do it without having to faff around and be like, where's the 15 things that I'm supposed to be
26
doing?
different systems that we're now using because it looks pretty. Let's just keep it really simple.
Really simple. Clear messaging, right? Sometimes I've heard over COVID something that I think is slightly wrong, which is that you can't over communicate. And that's not quite true. I think you can over communicate, because you actually get students in the situation where they feel like they've got to check all the time. And if they're not checking, they might miss something. And what's going on? Consistent, clear messaging, right? So for example, in my class through first semester, I just made sure that, because we weren't having that class touch base, I was sending out just an email at the start of the week on Monday. This is what we've got coming up this week. These are the things you need to do this week. See you in class on the Collaborate session on Wednesday. Really simple announcement to the whole class. So it's not something that takes lots of time on a teacher's behalf. Sometimes the other thing is we also feel like we've got to do things that are really laborious for us. So we've always got to manage what can we do with the resources we personally have. So I think strategies like that make things simple and doable, and then just being predictably available. So you may not teach every day of the week, and that's totally fine, but just nail out that time where you are going to be available. Think about different people's work hours. Maybe you do some early mornings and you do some late afternoon sessions, and make them predictable. I think that stuff matters more than even normal. I mean, normally it matters, normally that's the other thing. Normally it matters for a few people who every semester there's people who have been going through what we've all been going through this year, right? Every semester we have students who are managing sickness and difficulty working and loss of jobs and family crises, and every year we have students going through that.
Yes.
We just kind of ignore it, whereas COVID made us be really aware of it. So hopefully it sees us change that practice ongoingly, that then we're actually meeting the needs of everyone, not just the people that can show up on time.
And I remember way back, probably early this century, when I was doing a distance course, and our lecturer he shared with us at the end of term, he got the best result for on-campus students and the worst result for off-campus students. And it was just that thing of clear messaging, clear and consistent. What he was telling the kids, students in class, was not the same as what he was telling us. So he would forget to share it. And I think it's just that, just keeping it simple, keeping it clear, keeping it consistent, because what anyone needs in time of crisis is structure and clarity. Yeah. They need to know what they need to do, when they need to do it. It needs to be straightforward and simple. They need to not have any issues finding it. And I think also sometimes that simple, as we were talking about before we got on the podcast, is easier because not all our students actually have access to high broad width, and they're really limited. And so if they can't access a video,
I had a number of students who couldn't pay their bills through the semester, and so and they were able to access scholarships and help and everything, but it's just that the need is bigger than what's available. And so when you can't pay your bills, your internet goes. And so it's not even that they don't have access to it, it's that and I remember being in that situation as a student. I often didn't have money month to month. And so this idea that students just can, pay it's only $30. Well, $30 is a huge amount of money for some people. And I do think it's easy to forget that. So, making it accessible so that they can do the work required. If they can only be on campus for 2 hours to use the internet and the computers at uni, because that's when they've got childcare or whatever it is, then we need to make it so that 2 hours they're actually doing the work that's related to their learning, not the faffing around
stuff. Yeah. And I think we see that with students not responding to email, is that there's so many different ways information comes in and they can't actually sort it out, so they stop looking.
And so there's the other issue is, I guess, the stuff that we sometimes feel like we don't have control over, but actually I think we can influence more than we think we can as teachers, which is the university-wide approach to those issues. And so here at Flinders, we've spent a lot of time working around our retention and success strategy, working on our digital environment and our student platform, and really this whole year rechanging how that works for students, and really partnering with students to co-create that space. And that's actually created a really radically different product than we would have had if we'd just done it alone as an IT department, or as even as teaching staff. It's different because what students need access to and what they use frequently and what they care about is actually surprising. So having everyone working together, then you can create something that actually really is that navigable space that helps them to have access to what they need when they need it. And that takes a huge amount of cooperation across an organisation. I mean, a lot of hours, a lot of staff time, a lot of people being willing to review and re-review and re-review stuff to get it right. And so I guess what I'd say to any teacher is, if you have a team at your university that's working on that issue, work with them, because it's a huge amount of work, but it really can impact on the student's experience. Because obviously not everything, their experience is shaped by the entire online environment that your university is providing, not just the classroom.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good reminder. It is a whole of experience. Well, thank you so much. That's all the questions I had today, Lydia. Have you got some things that you'd like to share with us that you might be working on at the moment?
So the big thing we're working on here is really our student wellbeing plan. So you might, the listeners that are out there might be familiar with the Origin has been bringing out it's out in the consultation phase at the moment. They've got they're developing I'm going to get the word wrong, but it's basically like a set of guidelines for mental health in higher education. So one of the big things that we're working on over here is a university-wide holistic wellbeing plan. So that's, again, one of those things that requires everyone to come at the table and work together to make sure that we're developing something that can really guide and direct useful practice. Because I think when it comes to student success, student wellbeing, it's a really, there's only so many resources we ever have access to. And it's always that question of how do we use them in the most effective way to get the most support we can? How can we partner with organisations, community-based organisations, health and mental health supports, to make sure that our students have access to as many resources that are out there, right? The saddest thing to me is a student that doesn't know that there's help or doesn't know where to get help from. And so a lot of the work I think universities need to do is around making, it's not that we have to provide everything. We don't have the resources to provide everything ourselves, but we certainly can connect our students to where they can get help, and doing a better job of that. So that's kind of the thing that's really occupying my mind and brain at the moment.
Excellent.
And then I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of that in the next 12 months or so.
That sounds really exciting. And I love it when we have everyone come together to work on a common purpose, because what we can create is just amazing things that we would never do if it was just like a small group. As much as we need to start with a small group, it can be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think those core identity issues that we spoke about before, belonging, purpose, growth, all of that relates to us as staff members as well.
Yeah.
So, if we can lean into that space as leaders and start to create movement for our organisations, we're actually supporting the wellbeing of each other as well, which is, a really powerful thing, I think.
Yeah, no, that sounds really exciting. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of it too.
We'll see. Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. That's it for us for this episode of the Student Experience podcast, and thank you for listening.